All right, welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. Thank you for coming. Thank you, people on our live stream, for watching. I am very excited about this event. What we're going to do today is Professor Nolan McCarty of Princeton University is going to speak about his book, Polarization, What Everyone Needs to Know. I'm told it's part of a series of books that will teach you everything you need to know about a range of topics. I do not know what the other topics are. But that is not important because today we're going to talk about polarization. So Nolan's going to introduce the topic by talking about his book for, say, 20 minutes or so. After that, we will have a panel discussion in these seats here that were taken from the original Star Trek set. The panel will be formed by my colleague Daniel Cox, Jamie Settle from the College of William & Mary, and Hans Noel of Georgetown University. And I'll moderate. And we'll talk amongst ourselves, and then we'll do a Q&A, where you guys get to ask questions or yell at us. And then we will be done by 5:30. So that's it. And with that, Nolan, go ahead. And watch out, don't trip here.
Okay, great. It's a real honor to be here to talk about my recent book on a pretty esoteric topic, political polarization. It's not something we talk about every day, actually. Actually, it is. And so I was asked by Oxford University Press to actually write a book kind of summarizing what it is that social scientists, political science economists know about the topic of polarization in the United States in a way that sort of make it somewhat accessible to the broader public for the use of courses. I had written a few articles about kind of BuzzFeed-like articles. Here are the top 5 things you need to know about polarization, or here are the myths and realities of polarization. So this was really a chance to go further than that and to try to summarize what I think it is that we know, and probably most importantly, the things that we don't know. So the book is organized around about 40 questions that are asked and answered about polarization in the United States, including what is polarization, how does it differ from other forms of political conflict, are the American elites, elected officials polarized, or the public polarized? What are the causes and the consequences? And the final chapter that I'll talk about toward the end, what about Donald Trump? So what I want to do in my sort of 20 minutes introduction is just kind of lay out what I think are kind of the very basic facts about polarization, things that we've been able to measure in kind of a credible, robust way, and to talk a little bit about the implications for the broader topic of polarization and other forms of political conflict in the United States. Let's see. Oh, there we go. Let me skip ahead. Okay. I'm going to start with somewhere in the middle and talk about polarization among American elites, with a focus on legislative polarization. That's actually where I got started on the topic of studying polarization. I hate to say this now, but I began studying polarization in Congress in the early 1990s. In fact, the first publication on the topic was a monograph published by AEI, the American Enterprise Institute. Needless to say, as I'll explain in a second with this picture, it's been kind of a growth industry. It's quite good for a young scholar to find a topic that continues to be interesting and rewarding, probably bad for the country in ways that I'll talk about. So here's a measure of political polarization in the U.S. House and Senate that my colleagues Keith Poole, Howard Rosenthal, and I have sort of developed and used over the years. Let me briefly explain it in terms of its underlying data, which are roll call votes. So we are able to estimate political polarization by estimating how conservative or liberal each legislator, or almost every legislator, is in Congress, and just comparing the average differences between Democrats and Republicans. One thing I talk about in the book is that there are lots of other ways to measure political polarization. in Congress and among elites and elected officials, they all pretty much give a very similar pattern. So I'm going to stick to the data that I've been using for almost 25 years now, showing the polarization in the House and Senate. I'm happy to answer questions about measurement toward the end. So here's a figure again showing the average difference between Democrats and Republicans on a conservatism scale. So the first takeaway, and so the first thing that one needs to know about polarization is that it's varied over time. It's not the case that the parties have always been at each other's throats and unable to cooperate in terms of the roll call voting. And it's also not the case that there's been very little difference between the parties over time. There have been periods in which polarization was quite low, namely the period from like the late 1920s through the 1960s, as well as periods in which polarization in Congress and partisan and ideological terms have been quite large. Namely, obviously at the end of the Civil War and Reconstruction, partisan and regional differences were quite high. They fell over time. But probably what we're most interested today is the contemporary period, which began in the mid-1970s when the partisan differences between Democrats and Republicans have grown dramatically over time. So as I said, this current trend toward greater and greater polarization began in the late 70s. My colleagues, my co-authors detected it as early as 1982. So one of the things, the second point then therefore that I'd make that we need to know about polarization, it's hard to argue that it's related to any single event or great person. The trend, or the turn in the trend precedes the election of Ronald Reagan. It's before the unsuccessful nomination of Robert Bork, the impeachment of Clinton, or the election of Barack Obama or Donald Trump. It's really a much longer trend than that and calls for longer-term explanations than those one-offs provide. A second takeaway point is that polarization in the House and Senate have remarkably similar trajectories. They tend to decline together, they stabilized in the middle of the 20th century together, and they began increasing together in the late 1970s. In general, perhaps on average, there's less polarization in the Senate, as you might expect, given that senators tend to represent larger, more diverse constituencies, but there actually are periods in which the Senate was more polarized than the House. Although polarization in the Senate has leveled off in the early 2000s, it has increased faster than it has in the House over the past several years. So this suggests that these are not institutional matters. It's not how the House and the Senate conduct themselves, how they take roll call votes, how their committee systems differ. There really is something similar and systematic. So a second set of observations about polarization is an understanding that, for the most part, it has not been symmetric, and that movements of the Democratic Party to the left have been matched by movements of the Republican Party to the right. For the most part, with some exceptions I'll note in a second, polarization has been because the Republican Party has moved to the right. As a reflection of the success of the conservative movement. What we find in the data is that every new cohort of Republican legislators has compiled a more conservative voting record than the returning cohort. The same is not true of the Democratic Party. This fact about the Republican Party's new cohorts being more conservative than old cohorts is not simply a reflection of the Tea Party. It's a pattern that goes back to the 1970s. As I said, the Democratic Party hasn't really followed a similar pattern. Some cohorts are more liberal than the old cohorts. Some new cohorts are more moderate than the old cohorts. But the Democratic Party has not followed the same pattern. There is some movement to the left of the Democratic Party, which you can see, but that's mostly accounted for by the increased numbers of African American and Latino legislators in their caucus. So-called white suburban Democrats have tended to not polarize. A couple of caveats about this. Part of this asymmetric pattern is driven by the agenda of Congress, which is heavily dominated by economic and regulatory issues. less on kind of social and cultural issues, which tend to get handled by the courts. One might argue the Democratic Party has moved further to the left on those issues than the Republican Party has moved to the right. Second caveat is that this figure has not been updated following the 2018 election, in which case there's some evidence at least parts of the Democratic Party has a progressive cohort has grown, although many new Democrats in 2018 were also moderate. Okay, so that's the second set of facts, the asymmetry. A third thing that any discussion about polarization should also recognize is that it's not only a national phenomenon, it's a phenomenon that takes place in the states. So here are some polarization measures that my colleague Boris Shore and I have calculated based on collections of state legislative roll call voting back to the 1990s. We don't go back as far back as we do for Congress, but by these measures you can see very similar patterns to the US Congress. State lower chambers and state upper chambers are all polarizing. They're polarizing essentially at the same rate. So polarization is a phenomenon at the states. It's not just about the national government. One of the facts that doesn't make it into the book, because I've only been working on it more recently, is that polarization across states has increased pretty dramatically. So the differences between how liberal the Massachusetts legislature is and how conservative the Texas legislature is has grown in magnitude over the past 15 years. And so we're not only seeing polarization between Democrats and Republicans, we're seeing dramatic polarization across the states in terms of their policy preferences. So perhaps the sort of the takeaways of all these points is that levels of polarization that we've witnessed in Congress and in the states have not taken place overnight. It's been a 40-year process. We can tell at the national level. We can see that it's at least a 20-year process in the states with expectations that it goes back even further in the states. So it takes us into another set of observations is like, well, given these kind of deep roots and the long trends, are there other things that we might infer about polarization? And that is that certain smaller reforms may not be that effective in dealing with its consequences, at least at the legislative level. So for example, many political scientists have considered the question whether redistricting or gerrymandering has had a major polarizing effect on our politics. Okay. That particular story is a little bit hard to square with a story in which I've just showed you, in which the House and the Senate polarize at roughly the same rate. Obviously, the Senate hasn't been gerrymandered since the Dakotas were split in the 1890s, yet polarization has proceeded apace. It's also hard to reconcile with this kind of longer-term trends. You don't see big major breaks associated with decennial reapportionment in redistricting. Okay, so probably gerrymandering. One other point about gerrymandering I should mention is gerrymandering was obviously worse before the 1960s, before the Supreme Court ruled that it was justiciable and that things like one person, one vote were necessary. Therefore, things like gerrymandering perhaps don't matter very much. Partisan primaries, another situation where political scientists have not found much evidence that partisan primaries as opposed to nonpartisan, more open primaries are more polarizing. Again, the basic evidence of that is that primaries used to be much more partisan than they are today. We have many more open primaries in states than we once did, yet polarization has proceeded apace. So even at this very basic level of just looking at the time series evidence, you can learn a lot of the things that I think people need to know about polarization. So let me talk about some of the other issues that I address in the book. The first is the obvious one you might ask is, well, I'm talking mostly about political elites in Congress. What about the public? There's some differences of opinion on that topic, but let me give you my takeaway. This is an area where some of the panelists may have some differences. But the evidence on polarization among the general public is actually fairly nuanced and not all that strong. So one of the things we know for sure is that voters have tended to sort into political parties better. So the Republicans are more likely to be conservatives and Democrats are more likely to be liberals. That's pretty much undisputed. But whether or not liberals and conservative voters have become more extreme in their views over the past 30 or 40 years is still unclear. Part of it's a measurement issue. Part of it is, in fact, it may well be the case that primarily what's happening in the electorate is that conservatives are now almost all Republicans, liberals are almost all Democrats. That has important consequences for how elections are conducted in our system, but it's quite different than kind of extreme voices in the public dominating the political system. There's one exception to this, and that is if you compare the policy preferences of Republicans and Democrats, they've diverged. If you look at that divergence among kind of sophisticated, high information voters, it's bigger than with lower voters, suggesting that there's been something of a polarizing effect of engagement, that those who have the most extreme views tend to be more engaged. They may not have more extreme views, but they're more engaged relative to people who are less engaged in the middle of the spectrum. Okay, so there's some subtle differences between elite polarization and mass polarization. The other thing I should mention is that mass polarization tends to occur later. Really, where we even think that it's going on, it tends to be dated back to the 1990s rather than back to the 1970s. Another thing I deal with in the book, which has gotten a lot of attention in recent years, is the idea of affective polarization, the extent to which Democrats and Republicans just don't like each other. One of the kind of striking statistics that people have pointed to is that if you ask people whether or not they'd be comfortable with their child marrying somebody from a family of the other party, the percentage of people who are uncomfortable with inter-party marriages is much higher than people's discomfort with interracial marriages were in the 1960s. So there really is kind of some sense in which Democrats and Republicans have prejudices against one another. They don't like each other for a variety of reasons. One of the things I do in the book is try to unpack the sources of that conflict, the extent to which it's actually just pure identity politics animus, or which it might be related to this kind of sorting of positions where Republicans are overwhelmingly conservatives, Democrats are overwhelmingly liberals, and that people's perceptions are based on those ideological differences. Then I deal with the causes of polarization. Because it's kind of a long-term phenomenon, I really do stress the ways in which important, what we might call macro historical events are important. The Southern realignment, of course, and its effects on the Democratic Party and subsequent effects on the Republican Party. The massive changes in the demography and the economy of the United States and the ways in which those engender partisan political conflict, both at the Congress and interest group level, but in the public as well. And then kind of review some of the evidence on kind of reforms. What are the types of reforms which might ameliorate the effects of polarization or help eliminate it? As I've already alluded to, I'm somewhat skeptical about things like gerrymandering, primary reform. The evidence, I think, is much more open to campaign finance effects, but they're not the kind of campaign finance reforms that most people expect. When I bring up the topic of campaign finance and polarization, they automatically think Citizens United. Let's get the corporate money out of politics. Turns out there's a lot of evidence that corporate money is not the problem if you're concerned about polarization. It's actually the increased donations from individuals. And it's not even the wealthy individuals that are really the problem. It's that so much small dollar money is coming from people with very extreme policy preferences. And so I discussed the fact that the campaign finance reform agenda may be important, but may get things kind of exactly wrong. I'm sort of happy to talk more about that. And then, of course, I think any work on polarization has to deal with the so what. What is the consequences for governance, the impact that polarization has had on Congress, its ability to deliberate, govern, to effectively provide a check on the executive branch, to manage the federal system. And there I find that the evidence is quite negative in terms of congressional capacity to solve these problems. And finally, and I think this may well be where the panel and the audience may want to take us, I deal with the question of what about Donald Trump? And so the name of the chapter is the Trump presidency a new normal or more of the same? And I put off writing that chapter for a very long time because I didn't know the answer. The puzzle centers on the fact that he's not the orthodox conservative Republican that's been really an important driver of the polarization over the long course of time. He's much more heterodox. He could have been the sort of leader who could have reduced polarization because of his heterodoxy and unorthodoxy. Yet that hasn't happened. So is that his failure? Is that the resilience of the system that I discussed in the rest of the book? Or is it just too early? To tell? So with that, let me stop, and I look forward to the panel discussion and the audience questions and answers.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Nolan. I'm going to refrain from delivering my own views on this because I am the moderator. And instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask Jamie, because you have written extensively, and I think you're working on a new book. You just told me that also deals with this, about polarization, not so much among the elites, but about people, say, on Facebook or who walk around town and they see other people. So obviously, feel free to talk about whatever aspect of Nolan's talk you thought were deeply objectionable. But can you talk about that a little bit as well, about how not so much people in the House or in the Senate deal with these issues, but just normal people online.
Yeah, no, I'd be happy to. I found the book very accessible. I'm really excited to teach from it. I think that it really distills a lot of these debates down very clearly. And I appreciated in the book the nod you had to social identity theory. And I think that's really been a growth area within the study of American political behavior, this idea, thinking about how people conceptualize themselves and as part of groups and how that may contribute to what we're observing. I think there's a lot more to the story. If I had to make a prediction, if you were to write this book 5 years from now, I think you'd need to have another chapter there to really encompass everything that we're on the cusp of learning. I think that one of the things I found in my own work is that the people who are most susceptible to the polarizing effects of social media, and when I talk about polarization here, I'm talking about psychological forms of polarization. So what you mentioned is affective polarization, or the idea of perceived polarization, the notion that Democrats and Republicans are farther apart from each other than they really are in reality. The people who are most susceptible to the polarizing effects of Facebook, for example, are those who have the lowest levels of political interest. And so we already know that people who are strong partisans, we already know that they're polarized in these ways. They don't need social media to help them understand the differences between the left and right in America. But for those people who don't care very much about politics and are really accessing their understanding of what's going on in America through things like Facebook, they're the ones for whom the more they use these sites, the higher they score on measures of psychological polarization. And so I think that this notion that it's only the most engaged Americans who are becoming polarized, you're right that the strongest evidence so far does suggest that, but I think in the next few years we're going to see other ways in which less interested Americans are in fact polarizing. I think another thing to keep in mind here is the effects of polarization on the politicization we see in our society. So I'm thinking about things like boycotts, for example. I'm thinking about sports athletes who take controversial stances. And when
A
people...
boycott is a consumer boycott?
Yes,
Okay.
yes. And I think now there are ways to unintentionally signal your political views, even if you don't think that you're talking about politics. And in that sense, if we think about the pairing of social sorting, which you really get into, plus changes in technology and changes in the norms in our society about how people communicate and express their identities, we're setting ourselves up for a situation where you really don't have to be talking about politics at all to broadcast to people what you likely think about related issues. And so I think that's going to be important moving forward. I think the third thing to think about is the predictions of social identity theory.
But so is this mostly, this is just a symptom of sorting? Is that how you think about it, or?
I think that sorting sets up the preconditions for it. I think that elite polarization provides the fodder for it. But it's ways that Americans, without even meaning to, are able to map other people's social identities and political identities together. And so I think you're right, the polarization of the masses doesn't seem to have too much to do with people's actual policy preferences, right? But now all of our other identities are so wrapped up into our political views that that's signaling to other people that there's an us and a them that are really far apart. And unfortunately, social psychologists have been studying social identity theory for upwards of 50, 60 years, and the outcomes, the logical extension of what we're seeing is that the groups begin to judge each other on all sorts of characteristics that have nothing to do with what divided them in the first place. And so we may be able to point to differences between Democrats and Republicans or liberals and conservatives that are rooted in policy differences, that are rooted in different conceptions of how the government should function and its role in society. But over time, we're going to become more judgmental about things that are far afield. And I think this is why this intermarriage question that you posed really gets to the core of that, in the sense of what does make people concerned about their child marrying someone, right? This has to do with values and worldviews, and it's not necessarily what you think about the issues of the day, but what you think about their attitudes, more deep-seated values are. And here I think we need to worry about things like declining trust in government and the delegitimation of government, concerns about electoral integrity, even such things like political violence. I think you see increasing number of Americans who are saying that political violence would be acceptable if their party loses a presidential election. And here I think those of us who study American politics have a lot to learn from our colleagues who study comparative politics and who have been studying these processes in other countries.
So this always fascinates me, because if you look at Nolan's figures, the late 60s look great, right? There's no polarization, everyone's super happy. And yet you had, riots everywhere, political, assassinations, terrorist attacks, constantly. How do you square those two things?
That's a great question.
If at all.
Yeah. So I think that we can point to many eras in which American politics have been contentious, right? But I think it is the identity alignment. It is the social sorting where if you know one fact about someone, you're likely to be able to predict their politics. And if you know how they feel about one political issue, you're likely to understand how they feel about another political issue. I wasn't alive during the Vietnam era, but from what I've heard, just knowing where someone stood, you didn't necessarily know where they stood on the other issues of the day. And I think that's different now. I think if you know how someone feels about abortion, you're likely to understand how they feel about other contentious issues.
Only you.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you thought it was fair to social identity theory, because I want to be fair, but also to push back a little bit. And the 60s question raises some of those issues for me. So I think you do have pretty strong identity politics. You have hippies versus Okies from Muskogee, and so those are about as ideational, identity as you can get. It just, for reasons that are not quite clear, it didn't really map onto the elite political structure in ways that those differences, cultural and other differences, do today. So, so one of the things I really tried to underscore in the book is that the logical connections between what's going on in the public and what's going on in elites are not as simple as people want them to be. And I think we need just, like all political scientists say, we just need more research to know exactly when those kind of cultural conflicts get politicized on an elite level, when elites are in a position to take advantage of them. Not that Nixon didn't take advantage of them, but he tried to, and when they don't. I mean, the other interesting question, which again is a kind of a chicken and egg question, is, we do find policy preferences correlating with these identities, and it's just been very difficult for us to figure out, which came first, the identities or the policy preferences. There's a lot of recent stuff looking at how Republican identifiers have changed policy positions to align themselves with the Republican Party. So it does look like there's some real causal impact of the partisan identity over the policy preferences. But I think there's still some kind of work to be done to target exactly when and where policy precedes identity and where identity precedes policy.
So obviously one important feature of people's identity is their religious identity. I know, Dan, you've done a lot of work on this. I saw you recently wrote an op-ed, or I guess piece of analysis, arguing that the politics, the political views associated with the religious right have been driving liberals away from churches and from organized religion. Right? So that seems like a pretty extreme feature of what Jamie talks about, right? That your political views make you dislike features sort of quintessentially associated with the other side, that you change your own lifestyle. Right? That's a pretty. Can you talk about that a little bit and how you think it works into the things Nolan and Jamie have talked about?
Yeah, sure. No, so I am not a scholar of political polarization. I do more on religion, cultural change. So the more I read on this topic, the more depressed I got, actually. And so I want to touch on a couple things, but the article you referenced was about looking at the increasing alignment between religious identity and political identity, and I focus particularly on secular identity. So if you look about 30 years ago in the early 90s, there was a low correlation between political ideology and religious identity. So people who were extremely liberal were not much more likely to be unaffiliated, religiously unaffiliated, than people who were extremely conservative. But if you look at the most recent data from the General Social Survey in 2018, now it's 49% of people who identify as extremely liberal are not religious, compared to about 1 in 10 conservatives, or extremely conservative. So we're seeing this increasing relationship between political identity and religious identity, and you've touched on some of that. And Liliana Mason has mentioned that a lot in her book as well, which I think is increasingly important. But the thing I actually would love to just throw out on the table is this idea that Democrats don't want their children marrying Republicans don't want their kids marrying Democrats. Because that seems pretty problematic on a number of levels, right? Like, so I look at a lot of religious homophily, which is the tendency for people who are religiously alike to associate, get married, whatever. And there's a lot of recent scholarship that we're seeing increasing political homophily. So Democrats associating with and marrying other Democrats, Republicans doing the same. And what's happening is that when you have political couples that are aligned, political socialization is much more effective, right? So in my work, I see that secular couples are increasing, and they're increasingly raising other people who are not religious. Because again, the religious socialization is much more effective when both parents are in agreement. And that seems, to me, again, pretty problematic, because how do you break that cycle? There's a paper called The Home as a Political Fortress, which I thought was pretty amazing. And what they suggest is pretty dispiriting. They're saying we're going to see an increasing vicious cycle where polarization in families is growing, and it's going to keep us sort of further apart. So I know you didn't mention that a lot in your book, but I would love any of the panelists who do a lot of work in this area to sort of, maybe your read isn't quite as negative or pessimistic as mine, but I thought that really stood out to me.
Well, let's turn to Hunt, whose outstanding recent book suggests that it's all part of a big plan, which in some sense, would suggest that it's not all negative as they make it.
Yeah, I mean, there's.
I don't know if that's your preferred read of your.
No, well, I don't know if that's. perhaps independent of the book, I don't know that it's necessarily a bad thing. I mean, like in your example just now, I have some things to say about on the topic right here. I mean, when you say, there's a secular person married another secular person, they're going to raise secular. So you just described my family, and we're quite happy with that possibility, right? I would love to I would rather my child agree with me on things, more or less, because, I don't want to have a conflict with them, right? Especially on questions of religion, right? It seems would be really problematic if you had like religious tensions. And I think the way in which religions, interfaith families work, and I know it's the ones that I know, they just don't care about religion very much at all, right? And so I think part of the reason why you're seeing this on politics, to steer this back, and why you're seeing the effect there is that politics matters to us more and more, and but whether it matters in reality or we just care more about it, right? It could be, there's a really interesting book coming out by Eitan Hirsch about the degree to which our politics is just about consumption and fun and not actually about accomplishing things. But whatever it is, we care about it, and so then you'd expect that it would be hard to marry across the lines. It'd be a person who you really disagree with. So it seems like what we really need is what's dispiriting is that we don't seem to have institutions that are designed to handle that kind of diversity politically. Not that the world is going to have diversity, and maybe it just will happen. So I think it's how this all connects back to the institutions, which is a nice bridge back to what I would want to say about what Nolan was saying. Which is, so I love this book. It's a really useful book and really interesting. I'm also looking forward to teaching from it. What I think is one of the as yet unmentioned really great features of it is the two very long appendices about methods. Right. So there's there's all these nominate scores that Nolan so you pictured of, and where do those come from? What's going on with that? Well, you got a chapter in there that explains about that, and then there's all these survey work, and that's also well explained. I mean, one of the things I find frustrating sometimes in discussing academia in settings like this where we're reaching out beyond our fellow academics is sometimes feel like, well, you guys are all off there trying to figure out what the proper standard error is on that estimate of something, and then suddenly it's all jargon and it doesn't matter. Well, there's a reason we do that, which is that you can't answer these questions unless you can properly measure polarization. And so what's nice about this book is it actually takes you down. You don't need to know what the difference is between a quadratic or Gaussian loss function in estimating ideal points. You need to understand that. So that's not what Nolan talks about. He talks about the parts you do need to understand, but that's there and it's really useful. But I also think that's one of the places where there's a lot more work that we could do on this. Because related to the working on the methods and working into these pieces is the way in which different methods measure different concepts. And so there's a lot of division, and you saw this in the presentation, between polarization in legislatures as people are maybe moving away from each other in some kind of space, and then polarization among voters, and I think correctly identifying that partisan disagreement is not the same as polarization. And they're not the same, and that's really important, but they're probably pretty related. And the degree to which they're related and how they're related is, I think, the next question that we want to have. So to borrow Jamie's framework, 5 years from now, I think we would want to have not only a discussion of, a deeper discussion of negative polarization, affective polarization, negative partisanship, and all those things, but how they feed back and forth for partisan questions. I mean, what would it take for a member of Congress to vote in a moderate way, according to what nominate scores involve? Well, they'd have to be willing to vote against some people in their own party and with the people of a different party. And why don't they do that? Because they know, for example, that if they do that, Donald Trump is going to call them out on Twitter, and a bunch of people who just hate the other side are going to find out about it and not want to vote for them. So the affective polarization is one of the things that's constraining people in the legislature. I don't think it's the only thing. I think, as Nolan pointed out, the attitudes among the public lag some of these other changes. But how does sorting connect to these other things? And then this again gets back to the measurement question, because there's a real way in which you could talk about what's happened in the polarization in Congress as also sorting. There were conservative Democrats and liberal Republicans, and they've switched parties. Some of them by leaving the legislature and being replaced by new people. Some of them by literally changing parties or changing their attitudes about things. And that sorting is maybe the real thing that's driving things. To get to the question about in the 1960s, what the difference with the 1960s is that we were perhaps even more polarized in terms of at each other's throats over political questions, but we weren't sorted. And I'm not sure which is better, to be honest, but if there are problems with polarization, which I think are well documented, then the solution probably isn't to be at each other's throats, but within parties, the way we were in the 60s. That's probably not the best solution. But again, tying all these things together is sort of the next frontier in this. And we can't do that without the foundation that I think is well summarized in the book.
Because there's definitely a line of thinking that I think was more popular in the 60s, that it's kind of nice to have these clear policy contrasts, and you know what the parties stand for. I guess it's kind of what underlies the idea of the UK democracy to the extent that it still exists. In my homeland of the Netherlands, Democrat 66 was founded very explicitly with that idea in mind. So why is it all bad, Nolan? Because the tone of the book is definitely, this is a phenomenon that's not good. Here are potential explanations for this bad thing. Here are ways to address it that won't work. But here's a discussion of them. What's your personal view of? What are the upsides? What are the downsides?
So if I were writing in the 60s, I would have agreed with the consensus that the parties were not coherent enough, and that they needed to be, the lingo that was used by political science, more responsible, that they needed to take clear, distinctive positions, run on those positions, and allow voters to hold them accountable in terms of whether or not they carried out those promises. So I would agree with that, but the problem that we've sort of learned over the past 30, 40 years is that model of what parties should do lies uncomfortably with our separation of power system. The fact that we could emerge with kind of a very distinctive, polarized, sorted party system on top of, in the midst of a separation of powers system in which there's potential differences in partisanship between the president and Congress, differences across the federal system where differences across the 50 states. That kind of level of partisan animosity, especially when it gets layered on top of this affective polarization among voters, makes our system very unlikely to work very well. I think it's kind of like a Goldilocks problem, and probably there wasn't enough polarization sorting in the 1960s. The fractionalization of the party system was the major impediment to good governance. Today, it's polarization. And then, so when we think about what we would like to see next, I think we have to consider that the kind of fractionalization had its downsides too, and we may not want to go back to that. So one of the things that's kind of in the reform ether these days is some ways of kind of tricking our system into proportional representation. Instead of our first past the post electoral system, which tends to generate just two parties, we want to have electoral reforms like rank approval voting, et cetera, which would lead to more proportionality between election results and votes, which in itself would be a good thing. But we know comparatively that's likely to lead to many more parties, a proliferation of parties. And so then we might not have polarization because there might be some parties in the center, or there'll be some parties in the left, some parties in the right. But we have the sort of like 1960s fractionalization of the system where we really had like four parties: the liberal Republicans, the conservative Republicans, the conservative Democrats, and the liberal Democrats. So we do have to pick our poison. We have to pick somewhere between the fractionalization of this two-party system in the 1960s with this kind of like, hyper-polarized system of today. It'd be nice if I had enough scientific confidence to point where exactly on that chart that Goldilocks point was reached. I don't, but my conjecture is that somewhere between 1967 and 2016-17, it was better than it was either in 1967 or than it is in 2017.
And so, how do you move along that spectrum? I don't know. Are there clues in social identity theory that tell us how we move back to a slightly less polarized level? Is it emphasizing other cleavages that are, to the extent that they exist, orthogonal to the things that people associate with political views? What's the...
Yeah, I mean, I think it's tough. I think a lot of these things feel like a downward spiral, right? And they're very self-perpetuating.
They're upward, you know.
I mean, I think, so from my perspective, sort of this idea of the mass public, I mean, I think one thing is to emphasize your counter-stereotypic traits, right? So if you are a liberal Democrat who loves country music and drives a truck, make sure to get out there, right? If you are a conservative who really enjoys kale that you drive, you know, to the farmer's market in your hybrid vehicle, make sure that gets out there too, right? And I think, you know, it's a silly example, but that notion of making sure that we recognize the diversity and heterogeneity within the parties, within the coalitions, would help start to break that. But that's really sort of on the surface, right? We can work on that as a society, and we can talk about whether our political culture and the norms in our society, sort of informal institutions, are set up in a way to help people have these sorts of constructive conversations. But that's on the margin. That's not going to help with these more crucial institutional questions that I think we haven't yet figured out how to reverse the trend.
So, yes.
I just follow it. I think it's important to note, and I think we probably all agree, that the differences between the parties on these kind of social identity measures are not as extreme as most people think. A lot of it's kind of perceptions about what a typical Republican is or what a typical Democrat is. So I was in a kind of an unusual situation. You know, I'm a Ivy League professor. I live in Princeton, New Jersey, but my son joined the NRA, but I drove a Volvo. I was registered with the anti-typical party of Princeton, New Jersey. And so my mailings were like all over the place, right? In reality, I think there are many more people, you know, like me. And this idea that these political consultants have it down to complete science where they can look at your magazine subscriptions, know how you vote, it's just some voodoo that political consultants sell. I hope there are not that many in here, but I think it's worth recognizing that there's a lot more variation in people's identities, even within these parties today. And as Jamie said, highlighting that, and perhaps people who know that fact can go a long way.
They're definitely a group that looks a little worse after the 2016 election than before as well, I think.
Yeah.
So Hans, to go back, sorry to keep bring up your book, but so in your book you talk about how sort of ideologues have really shaped the current partisan coalitions, right? And so an obvious lesson would be that, you know, you go through a new ideological realignment, and for a while that throws things into flux, and that automatically reduces polarization. Is that something you see coming? Because we do, you know, there's a bit of ideological reorientation going on in the two parties, and so some people will be in the wrong spot for a while. Do you see that happening?
So I mean, it's hard to say looking forward. It's always hard to know where things are going.
I'm not going to forecast anything.
And no, I was very just like complete digression, but I was very confident that Donald Trump was not going to be the nominee in 2016, and said so in forums like this. So I'm out of the prediction business altogether because I'm not going to say that stuff. But I mean, no, it's a definitely.
You think he's going to be the nominee
in 2016?
In 2020?
In 2020? See, I have no idea. but again, I haven't been watching the news for the last hour, so I don't know. So I mean, I'm happy to talk about the book. It's called Political Party Ideology, Political Parties in America, Cambridge University Press. I'm happy. 2013. Happy to. So the thesis of the book is that a lot of this realignment that we see, at least on the substance, between the parties, the sorting of the parties, is preceded by some stuff outside of the elected political officials. And I focus in the book on political pundits, but it's broader than that. And I mean, Nolan pointed out that part of the divergence that you see among the conservative, sort of polarization on the conservative end, was part of the conservative movement. And that's the idea, is that there's movement of folks, and there is a counter movement on the liberal side, and it wasn't as effective in terms of polarization, but it was effective in terms of changing the nature of the Democratic Party between the 1940s and 50s and the 1970s, and that happened. It just didn't. The consequence wasn't exactly polarization. And so part of what they've done is they've taught people what it means to be liberal and conservative, and that's what we have as these two things. And then the parties have come along, and that's where the polarization is coming in. So there are places where there's some divergence in what's been going on, some recapturing. So far, it isn't so much that it seems to be like a convergence, right? There's parties are shifting and changing, and the conservative movement is becoming sort of more concerned about questions of nationalism and things that would appeal to a populist, and so that's making change. But it's not like the Democratic Party and the consequence, and the liberal movement, in consequence, is like scooping up that free market piece of the conservative alignment, at least not to this point. But I think it is possible. There are lots of other threads that are out there. And to get to Nolan's point about more fragmentation, if we had institutions that meant more parties or something, then maybe the other ideological pockets that are out there could get some more ground and leverage and so forth. But I certainly do think that...
Because comparatively, that's what you see in Europe, right? Most countries have seen their number of parties.
Yeah, the number of parties...
Most Western Europeans have seen their number of parties gone up.
Yeah, although there's still a fair amount of polarization of sorts,
sure,
right?
Yeah,
but the polarization is now like sometimes multidimensional. So like the Italian political system is as if you had a Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders all running at the same time, sort of. And that the last election was a real mess. And by the way, they're having a hard time holding that government together too, right? So like the consequences of this kind of polarization cannot always be nice and smooth. So I don't know that it's a solution to polarization, but I do think, though, that part of the answer is you've got people with really intense conservative identities that have a set of beliefs that aren't necessarily even conservative. And likewise, people with liberal or progressive identities, and their views are not consistent with that. And the more that, there may actually be some points of agreement that political thinkers can sort out and implement. The tricky thing is having them implement them in the bright sunlight of a polarized electorate. So I do think that there's some potential action from political thinkers, but I think our institutions are maybe the place that I would be more hopeful about the consequences of change.
I see. So Dan, one other route away from polarization that you sometimes hear about, there's a whole genre of punditry that focuses on this, is through community, by which the authors often mean through churches, right? That's really what it comes down to. From some of the things you've said so far, it sounds like that's going to be harder too, right? As those community institutions become more polarized themselves and more associated, certainly effectively with one side of the political spectrum or the other, how do you think that there's still hope for that those kind of fora that are explicitly not political to bring people together, or has that ship sailed too?
Yeah, no, I think that if you look at the ability of local congregations to get beyond differences of race, class, politics, they've failed on a number of fronts in terms of being an institution that can address it in a systematic way, right? The churches have been historically in this country pre-segregated by race. If you look at class, increasingly by class as well. And now there's signs that a lot of people who are somewhat left of center, more moderate, are leaving churches in pretty significant numbers. And so we're seeing a number of ways that these local institutions that were incredibly important for building comity and an agreement are either falling away or just not being utilized in a way that's effective. I would be interested, and I'll just again throw this question out, because I know there's some work in this area, and also some foundations are interested in engaging the issue of local news and the decline of local news and how that's played into this problem as well.
So Jen, do people share local news articles on Facebook, or is it all memes for boomers?
I think that I'm actually not sure people are completely aware of the sources that they are sharing, right? They're not paying that much attention. They're more captivated by the headline or whatnot. I mean, I agree with you. I think the decline of local news has a huge impact. But you then also see what local stations and local newspapers remain actively trying to capitalize on these new forms of technology to kind of keep afloat and keep people aware. But I think losing that domain to have conversations about local politics, which often are much less divisive along party lines, right, and giving people the forum to practice working together on issues that don't perfectly line up, I agree that would be contributing.
So it's more salient, I think, for this topic, but I want to ask this more broadly. So to what extent are these developments cohort effect, as opposed to, as in linked to specific generations, as opposed to sort of ongoing processes within each generation? Like, is it just that the people are now politically most influential, which I guess is the boomers and has been the boomers for as long as anyone can remember? Is it just that they are in their adulthood have turned out to be super polarized, and that kind of trickles down to other generations? Does any of you have strong views on this? Certainly, the media consumption, I think, varies quite a bit from generation to generation. I don't
think you can fully pick those things apart in the sense that if you think about political socialization, I mean, you have a generation that's being socialized in a way that's going to shape how they behave when they achieve power in a few decades.
Yeah.
So, even if you were to tease those apart now, I think the effects of those are going to be intertwined for a long time to come.
Oh, I see. You're saying 50 years from now we'll be able to tell, but not now. Nolan, do you have stronger views?
No.
No, okay.
I did want to ask Dan question, if I could, on this question. So one of the ways in which you can have a big change, given in a world in which identities are very strong, is if different identity groups tend to emphasize different parts of their identity differently. So there's been a lot of things I've seen written about evangelicals and how younger evangelicals are emphasizing different parts of their faith than older evangelicals in ways that might move them away from the Republican Party, like on the environment and climate change.
I actually just wrote a piece on that.
Okay, well, good, good.
No,
so what's your answer?
And that's true. Particularly, it's not just environmentalism. It's if you look at a lot of cultural issues and perceptions of cultural threats. So how much changing demographics, changing sort of ideas about sexuality, they feel sort of threatened or concerned about that. And it's incredibly different on the issue of immigration too. Again, they don't feel that the immigration issue rises to the level of concern as older evangelical Christians do.
Good. I want to turn to the audience for questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and I will or will not call on you. A mic will arrive. Please wait for the mic to arrive so that the people on the internet can hear you. And then please introduce yourself, and then pose a question. Usually, questions asked end in question marks. If you have a long, rambling comment to share, we can do that too. But then I may cut you off halfway through. So let's see if anyone has any questions. Let's go over there, table in the back, and then table right. Yes.
Thanks. I wondered whether or not.
Oh, sorry, don't forget to introduce yourself.
My name is Jim Nolan, and maybe I should be Nolan.
Nolanson.
I wondered whether or not you all believe that the decision in Roe v. Wade was a big contributor to polarization.
Possibly, but not the pictures that I showed you about Congress. The House and Senate almost never vote on abortion, with the exception of voting on the Hyde Amendment every year, and it's extremely partisan, that's for sure. It's clearly had a big impact among voters, but it had it in kind of a bipartisan way for a long time, because the differences between Democrats and Republicans on the issue of abortion didn't really start growing until the 1990s. So I think it has, over the long span of polarization, been a big contributor. But just naively looking at the data, it looks like there was a 15-year period in which that issue had to get attached to the party system in such a way that it became an important contributor to the partisan divisions among voters.
So would you say it catalyzed the polarization a bit in the 90s once it became?
I think it had in the book I use this kind of language of accelerants. It clearly, I think, it was an accelerant once it was mapped on to the differences between Republicans and Democrats. One thing I noted that I knew was true at one time about Congress was that the number of pro-choice Republicans far exceeded the number of pro-tax increase Republicans. That has now shifted somewhat. So for a very long period of time, a Republican member of Congress's position on taxes was much more predictive of which party a member's position on taxes was much more predictive of which party they were in. More recently, I think their position on abortion may be somewhat more predictive now that there are no longer any pro-choice Republicans.
How much of that is Catholic members becoming more flexible about their theological views?
There could be some of it. I mean, on the Democratic side, there still are kind of pro-life Democrats, but you know, that's again Catholics from the Midwest. They're being replaced over time by younger Catholics and non-Catholics who have different views. So there's a cohort effect in these changes as well. But in the public, it didn't really take off as a party-defining issue until the 1990s, and it took a very long time to, in this case, I think, trickle up to Congress, such that you don't have, you know, very many kind of conflicted, party abortion conflicted members in Congress now.
Okay, let's go.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Palexi. I was wondering about what you were saying about the psychological polarization being strongest in the least interested. I was wondering if you found that to be a contradiction as far as how we think about people who are more interested and more invested might be more polarized.
That's a great question. So let me clarify. So we know that people who are interested in most partisan overall are definitely more polarized. So they perceive greater differences between the parties. They have stronger negative feelings. I had a book come out last year called Frenemies: How Social Media Polarizes America, and I was really looking at what were the effects of social media. And the argument I'm making is that people who are interested don't need any more catalyst to be polarized, right? But if you're really going to see these changes in overall attitudes, higher negative, affect for people on the other side, you need to have that extend beyond just the strongest of partisans. And so it's the effect of social media as a polarizing agent is strongest on those people who have lower levels of political interest and less attachment to the party, because they had more room to grow, essentially. And so I think that's, in some ways I think it makes sense if you think about the amount of inadvertent exposure to politics. If you're scrolling through your Facebook newsfeed, you're going to encounter a lot. And if that's the main way you're getting access to politics, I could see how that would be more polarizing. I think one thing to think about is it's also these people who have the potential to be the most depolarizing forces, right? So for example, we know that people who are the most partisan are also they're more likely to be reading partisan news. They're more likely to have less confidence, for example, in the media and in oppositional media sources, for example. And so you can actually harness the power of these people who are less interested and more moderate on social media if you make some changes to value what they're contributing to the overall debate. And so it is concerning if they're the ones who are actually becoming more polarized instead of being allowed to be the depolarizing force.
There's also a key difference, I think, between the kind of less informed, less sophisticated voters and how they respond to social media. So for them, I think we rightfully worry a lot about fake news and like whether. So maybe a thing to do is have more vetting of news and get the fake news out of the system. The problem, though, I think with the more sophisticated readers is it's not really fake news in the sense of that their facts are wrong. It's that they're getting presented by certain media a particular worldview that puts true facts together in ways that are kind of coherent within an ideological system, but is going to be different than the way in which somebody from the other side puts the same facts together in a coherent ideological system. So the extent to which I've gotten into debates on social media with people, it's often not that their facts are wrong, it's just that they interpret them in kind of ways in which I couldn't ever personally conceive of interpreting them. And I think that's going to be kind of a harder problem to deal with. I think with the less sophisticated voters, if we can clean out some of the fake news, that'll go a long way. But getting Democrats, Republicans, conservatives, and liberals to look at the same set of facts and interpret them in similar ways is going to be much more challenging.
So why is it, do you guys think, that the most informed voters, the most dedicated voters, why do you think that they are sort of distributed in this U-shaped distribution as opposed to a normal distribution, which you normally see? Because that seems like a reasonable position to be in too, right? You sit there in the middle, really strongly held moderate views, and you look at everyone else as complete lunatics. Why is that not a more common position?
So part of the answer is that the moderates that do exist are not like you've just described.
Yeah.
Right. Most people who are moderate, of course, tend to be less informed because what you just described. But they tend to. It's not that they are literally in the middle. It's that they're inconsistent, ideologically speaking. Right. So they sometimes take a position that we would think of as conservative, and then they take a position that we would think of as liberal on a different policy. Then when I try to figure out where they are, they're in the middle, but they're not really in the middle, and they're very unlike another person who's also in the middle. In fact, there's at least some evidence, although I think this is less convincing, that that not only are they not moderate, but they're even more extreme. They're just extreme in different directions. I don't know if that's quite true, but
So they're flailing.
They're sort of flailing around. Right. And so, like this, part of the story is that as you start to look, pay attention and learn about more stuff, like the way you can piece together the facts that make sense for Nolan, and then the way that you can piece together the facts that make sense for somebody else are both coherent. And then the way that you would piece together the facts to be like in the middle, a lot of times isn't really there. Like there's some pretty big deal issues that really require pretty significant either policy changes or firm commitments to the status quo. And so it kind of makes sense that I don't know where the truth is, but it's probably one of these two, not this, is not complete. I mean, that's maybe a little bit bolder than I want to say it, but I think that's part of it. So they're the sensible middle that is taking 50% of every policy position may not actually be as coherent as we'd like to think it to be.
I see. Good.
And for those few people who really are informed and moderate, where are they supposed to send their energy, right? I mean, I think this is where Fiorina's argument about picking between polarized choices makes the most sense. If you want to be involved, you have to either spend an inordinate amount of time researching candidates at every level to figure out who is the right fit, or pick a side in order to advance whatever issue they're most important.
If you're a successful coffee shop entrepreneur, you send your money to political consultants, and then you drop out of the presidential race before you've ever even really started running. Let's take a few more questions. Let's go over here.
John Henry, Committee for the Republic. Couldn't resist. I bought your book, and I look forward to reading it. Being a Princeton professor, because my view is that we have two Americas. We have a Madisonian America and a Wilsonian America, and two Princeton graduates. And one wanted to concentrate power, and the other wanted to separate it. And so we live in a Wilsonian world. So when we're talking about extremes and moderates and all that, the two parties have really replaced the separation of powers now, and so you really have effective the Congress is a bullpen. The Pelosi and Mitch McConnell are sitting there trying to decide who's going to win the White House, and everything is geared to the White House. So how do you deal with that, being a Princeton professor?
It's a great framing of the question. So actually, Hans and I were having a discussion in the library/green room beforehand. He's talking about his Intro to American Politics course, where he said he just talked about political parties. And I'm like, it's too early in the semester to talk about political parties. You're supposed to teach American politics like the Constitution, Bill of Rights, federalism, then Congress, and then political parties are way down there. So we tend to teach political science in a very Madisonian way, and so parties are this kind of growth and mistake. And I think Hans has a different view, is like political parties are very central. I think to encapsulate my book, and I don't do it in the way you suggest, but maybe I should as a Princeton professor, is that it's really like we have this bad combination of Wilson and Madison. We have this kind of Wilsonian institution of responsible parties. They're supposed to act on platforms and solve problems, and a Madisonian system that's supposed to work exactly against that. And getting that balance, exactly right, is kind of the project of American democracy. And we don't get that balance exactly right all the time. I guess I come down more on the. I actually have somewhat complicated views on this. I actually think that one of the solutions to polarization, despite what I just said, is that in some sense we need to make parties somewhat stronger, in the sense that we need to insulate members from interest group pressures more than we do. So in addition to this kind of parties versus separation of powers institutions, we have this hyper-pluralistic world in which interest groups are very important, and they have this polarizing effect on members, and that parties have become, while they become more ideological and more coherent, they become weaker as institutions. And so
because what you want,
we
so what,
add- we
I
have to
guess
add
what you're
back
saying
into
is
that.
what you want labor unions and the Chamber of Commerce to send the same amount of money to both parties, but to the central committees, and then they give it to their members. That.
I think that would be a better. I think that would be a better system. I mean, I actually don't care who the Chamber of Commerce sends their money to. There are other groups
Okay.
that with much more extreme agendas. That it would be better if it were
Oh no, that's what I'm
channeled to
saying.
parties.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, it is this kind of mix of these. We don't have the right institutions for the right party system we have, and the party organizations aren't up to the task given the level of partisanship we have. So all those problems, I think, are kind of layered together in difficult ways.
I want to add something to that because I think this is the right way to think about it. It's a mismatch between how politics is working and what our institutions are. And I mean, the framers were really, really smart people, and they really worked hard to find out what the world was doing. And then and Wilson also unique among presidents as actually a political scientist at one point, and also tried to understand these things. We know, my students know vastly more about how all this stuff works than any of those people did. Not because they are smarter, but because we have learned stuff and we've taught them. And so I think part of the problem is that we have this institution, and I'm not saying we should scrap and start over because that's not sensible. But we have a set of institutions that we know much better how they work and how they function and how it would work in a different system, and what if we had a parliamentary system, and what actually is the separation of power and all those things. We know so much more about how that works, and that doesn't mean we have the answer right, but we ought to think about institutional design with all that information. And that's a place where maybe I'm just more confident that we can change institutions than we can change human behavior. Because what I know about human behavior is that the fragmentation that we're talking about is, to cycle back to Madison, sown in the nature of how people are, and so you can't get rid of that. You can't get rid of factions. The institutions that Madison imagined would get rid of factions didn't do it. In fact, they empowered those factions because that's how the factions beat his institutions, which is what you've described. And so we need to work on better institutions. And the one that Nolan was suggesting would be one I would endorse. No, I mean, stronger parties, for instance, that kind of institutions. I don't know that we can we already have the institution that has the separation. The Constitution still says that, and it's not doing it, right? So the institution, we need to, the people have beat the institution. So we need to adjust the institution to accommodate the way the people are. That's what Madison said to do in the first place. It's just that his solution wasn't effective.
Well, I mean, there's one area where separation can be restored, and it may also be conducive with stronger parties, and that is re-strengthening Congress vis-a-vis the executive. Partisanship really, I think, has destroyed the separation of powers because under divided government, everything just breaks down in policymaking wise, and under unified government, there's no executive accountability. I think you could actually restore the separation by kind of strengthening the hands of party leaders who have agenda, can kind of control the agendas and control the behavior of members, and channel them into slightly more productive ways, disciplined by electoral accountability. Now we're seeing playing out today, a situation where the Democratic Party is not very strong organizationally, yet they have to figure out kind of a common strategy for dealing with the president. The Republicans have had similar problems in the past under the Boehner speakership, and I think the weakness of the parties both hurt the Wilsonian project in ways of creating gridlock, but I think they also hurt the Madisonian project because they weaken the separation between Congress and the president in particular ways. They make it too acidic during divided government, and they've made it too passive during unified government. And so some restoration of parties might actually go a long way in restoring some of the benefits of the Madisonian system.
Okay, let's go over here.
John Soliday, did the decline of the Soviet Union and loss of an external threat to the U.S. add to polarization? And another question, what about the civil rights movement? Have these two events had any impact?
Well, the civil rights movement's a fairly easy one. It obviously did. It sort of pushed conservative whites out of the conservative Southern whites out of the Democratic Party. It also, when coupled with the Voting Rights Act, it led to important electoral transformation in the South, which sort of helped produce the Republican Party in the South in reaction to the changes in the Democratic Party. So the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act together.
You can show this, right? So the figures you showed of Republicans and Democrats, I've definitely seen a version with Northern and Southern Democrats.
With Northern Southern Democrats. So it's very clear that realignment of the party system, which was triggered by civil rights, was very important. The end of the Cold War is a little bit more is a little less obvious of an effect. I think at the time, at the time, I actually to date myself. So I graduated college in 1990, so walls were coming down and it was all happening. And the belief at the time was it was going to kind of be depolarizing, that they were going to take an important, divisive topic off the agenda, we could refocus on domestic priorities, and that it all happened. So it didn't happen. Polarization continued.
It looked like that would happen, right?
Yeah,
you had the third way, whatever.
Third way. All of this was kind of, we've taken the pillar out of, one of the pillars out of the polarized party system by anti-communism no longer being a force within the Democratic Party, and being soft on communism was no longer a thing that you could toss to the Democratic Party. So it was going to be depolarizing. It didn't depolarize, so it could just be netted out to zero. I mean, there were some effects that led in one direction, and then some effects that offset it. But if you look at the data, you don't see anything that clearly comes out of the end of the Cold War in the way that you kind of see coming out of the World War II. I think seems to have had pretty big depolarizing effect, but you don't see the end of the Cold War having a kind of a measurable effect in kind of the big aggregate measures.
Let's go over here.
Good afternoon, Al Deal, Deal Global Associates. If you were to use your crystal ball, do you see what might be an event or circumstances where the tide would turn away from polarization? I mean, with today's announcement by Nancy Pelosi that there's an impeachment inquiry in place, when the Democrat National Committee's caucus in California came out in their #1 session accomplishment was saying we're the party of non-believers as an effort to differentiate themselves from evangelicals. Also, worldwide, the polarization seems to be on the increase when you look at Brexit as an example. So I'm asking you to put your speculation caps on, and I'd appreciate hearing what you might think is an event that might change.
Well, Hans,
you don't do this anymore. You're out of this business. I don't take it. So much of my original research on polarization is kind of summarized in a book we wrote in 2006. So the last chapter is or the last section of the last chapter is something like, how will this end? And so we highlight 2 or 3 scenarios. One was...
and the worst one turned out to be right. Global financial crisis.
Right. So global financial crisis was on the list in the sense that, drawing on the analogy of the Great Depression, which really seemed to reorient politics in kind of a major way, and depending on who was responsible for such a, at that point, hypothetical financial crisis, could reorient politics in a way that's consistent with that party's priorities, and put the other party on the defensive and force them to kind of cooperate. So we had the financial crisis, and pretty much exactly the opposite happened, in large part because of some of the preconditions of our polarization, and that, as I alluded to before, Republicans could easily conceive of a narrative in which excessive government regulation, subsidies to the poor in the mortgage market, all of these, support of Fannie and Freddie were responsible for a financial crisis, and Democrats, liberals had a narrative that underregulation was responsible. So the net impact of the financial crisis, we all know, was more polarization and perhaps deeper polarization, and maybe, laying the seeds for populism on both the left and the right in both parties, which has an obvious polarizing effect. Another thing we suggested is that, very consistent with Hans' view, is that some political entrepreneurs could step in and kind of reorganize politics in a particular way. One possibility was for a slightly more socially conservative Democrat, kind of the Sherrod Brown kind of Democrat, becoming more influential in that party, in organizing around kind of economic populism and kind of social conservatism in a way that could kind of build up a large enough majority that would take some of the sting out of the partisan differences. Or you might imagine,
But so to some extent, you could say that that's what happened with Trump, right?
Well, yeah, there's a point I didn't get to. So, the Republican version of that argument, although we mostly talked about it in terms of like the more socially, Democrats taking social issues off the table just a bit, is like a Republican who takes the kind of some of the free market economic issues off the table a bit. So you have Donald Trump, who's very heterodox. He's kind of like not a free trader. His positions on immigration are not really consistent with the kind of establishment thinking in the Republican Party. He's for more infrastructure. He doesn't want to reform. He doesn't want to reform entitlements. And so, that's, potentially a recipe for building the type of coalition that could be dominant and the other party would have to emulate, except that, I think his own personal inclinations is not to build a large coalition, but to build a minimum winning coalition. So he did some other things to kind of offset those perhaps advantages, which has made things, worse in terms of polarization and not better. So those are really the two possibilities: political entrepreneurs and big events. Neither of them seem to work, and may indicate, maybe this is why you got depressed, may seem to be we're kind of past the point where those sorts of solutions will help ameliorate polarization, and we need to move in Hans's direction and think more about how to make the institutions work better, whether it's parties, or how to reinvigorate. One of the things I've been more interested in is how to reinvigorate Congress as an institution. But yeah, I think the kind of the big weaponry has been used, and it didn't work, and so we'll have to think about some other possibilities.
More narrowly, I'm happy to predict that the impeachment proceedings are not going to dramatically reduce polarization in the short run. Let's hope that one works.
So I said I was not doing this, and I won't. But I will say this: but whenever I do try to think about this, one of the things, like a lot of the stuff that we talked about, and then what are the possible explanations or accelerants in Nolan's term, or how do we think about what's going on in social media and so forth? I think a lot of what we're finding is there's something was started in the 70s, and then whether it led to or whatever, there's this other factors, and there's a lot of things that are feeding on each other that are making it more polarization. And so everything that you can think of, it makes it worse, not better. And so I don't know that means that I think it'll just continue forever, right? That's you get married, and if you plot the trajectory, you're gonna have 30 wives next month. That's not true. Let's not project that way. But But it's there's a lot of pressure that's this way, and so I do think actually a big event is likely to be what happens, and it might not be one that we like at all. Like a global financial crisis might seem like nothing compared to what happens. If we do think about a changes in institutions, there's, I think, I don't know a good measurement on this, but my sense is there's a more serious discussion about institutional change now than we've had in quite a while. But a lot of those institutional changes also don't strike me as actually going to make things better. They could make it worse, but they could break it. So, that's not like, if you weren't feeling good after you read the book, I'm not helping. But.
All right, we can do, I think, one last question, unless we are
It's right here.
all done. Oh, sorry, there we go.
Hi, I'm Don Rostel. My question is, at the moment it seems that there's more polarization in our political system over the personality and the governance style of the president than perhaps any particular issue. I understand that issues like abortion do structure, partisans' views of their party and the other party. But I'm wondering if there's any greater significance to Donald Trump's being in the White House in terms of moving us away from issue polarization, or as one aspect of polarization, toward polarization over personalities or political styles? Or can we expect new issues like abortion and same-sex marriage to pop up in the future after Donald Trump leaves the political scene?
I think it's unlikely to be abortion. The attitude's been incredibly stable on the issue, and the bulk of public opinion suggests that it's, American attitudes are somewhere in the middle on that issue, and same with same-sex marriage. Even in the early outset, there was a majority for the extreme position, but it wasn't overwhelming, and then that's now relatively a consensus issue, particularly among young people. I don't know if there's another economic issue, but for the cultural questions like marijuana legalization, I just don't see it nearly as polarizing as Donald Trump.
But I think on a lot of the economic issues, there is a ton of polarization, right? So we had a tax bill that passed on a party line 2 years ago. Before that, during the Obama administration, we had a massive healthcare reform bill that passed on party lines, so that the Wall Street supervision regulation bill. And so I do think that on a lot of those issues, we are superposed. Same thing for immigration, right? There's certainly the congressional elites are so polarized they can't even pass things that have support of like 70-80% of the population. Same for gun control. So I don't know that issue polarization has really faded away. I mean, if anything, I think that kind of level of issue polarization makes it much easier for someone with a personal style that's not very attractive even to some people on his own side of those issues to get elected. Right? Because the more polarized you are on the issues, the harder it is to vote for an opponent. That's my amateur political science.
Yeah, I think the question of like what happens after Donald Trump is a really crucial one. One of the things that is, well, the next standard bearer of the Republican Party, will it be kind of the Mitt Romney, Paul Ryan restoration, or will it be Trump without some of the personal liabilities, which has made him really ineffective as a president? And so the extent to which issues matter, which issues matter, the extent to which cultural and identity issues matter, are going to really hinge a lot on whether or not the post-Trump Republican Party is a restoration of the kind of establishment, pre-2016 establishment, what I like to call Jeb Rubio Republicans, or whether it's Tom Cotton or others who would like just be much more effective kind of economic, nationalist, populist Republicans.
Which is, ironically, where Marco Rubio himself is now.
Yeah, well, exactly. So Marco is actually trying to get into that game as well. So there's a lot of things are still up in the air about the future, and the president will not get impeached. It will increase polarization in the process, but at some point he'll leave the scene, and I think it's really an open question as to whether or not you see this kind of restoration, or whether you see much more effective nationalist, populist take over, and that will change the complexion of which issues are polarized, the extent of issue polarization, and the extent of kind of exploiting kind of identity differences in politics.
Excellent. All right. Well, to close on a positive note, those graphs that Nolan has been showing us, they have an upper bound, and so at some point the polarization is going to end. All right. Well, thank you all for coming. Thanks to our panelists.
Oh, great. Oh. Actually, I